Harbor City Council Ordinance Committee meeting of October 15th to order. Ms. Wong, would you read the roll, please?
Yes. Councilmember House.
Here.
Councilmember Rouse.
Here.
Councilmember Hutchins.
Here.
Okay, very good. We're going to start with our fire code adoption. And who's on? Mr. Poirier?
I am. Good afternoon, Chair House and members of the committee. We are here today to present the 2013 California Fire Code and the adoption process, an ordinance with local amendments, and in preparation of the state implementation of the same code on January 1st of 2014. As you may know, the code is a companion code to the California Building Codes, which is a presentation that's going to follow us here today. Just for a little bit of background and to refresh your memory, since we only do this about every 3 years or so, together the codes function as a comprehensive set of life safety and building codes for the city and for the state. The fire code, as well as the primary building code, are based on model codes which are published by the International Code Council. The International Code Council publishes a base code, and from there the state of California picks it up, and they flesh out that code. They accept certain parts of it, they reject certain parts of it, and then they write whole sections for the state of California. Those sections are then codified into one large binder like this, which is published as the California Fire Code. That will take effect on January 1 no matter what we do. But we are allowed to take that code and amend it further by local ordinance, and that's the ordinance that's before you today. And it allows state agencies to have their shot at it, but it also, if we have findings, and that's at the top of the ordinance, you'll see an area called findings in the ordinance that show different topographical, geological, and weather-related issues that are particular to a given area. And we can establish those findings. We can make changes that are more stringent to the state code, but not less. And so, that's what we pick up the code with a mind to do. In addition, we're free to add to those code sections as long as we don't do anything that loosens up the state code. An example is in Chapter 3 of the International Code. Since the Building Code is adopted by the Building Standards Commission and the Fire Code is adopted by that same agency, they can only adopt sections that are pertinent to building standards. In the Fire Code, we have sections in whole chapters that are not building standard related at all. A good example is that Chapter 3. In Chapter 3, it's important to us because it has a lot of sections in it that relate to general fire and life safety, maintenance, behavior, those kinds of things that we enforce on a regular basis. So when we get a copy of the code, it still has that international section in it with a note that the state fire marshal does not adopt it, so it's not part of the state code. That's one of the things that we then incorporated into our code and we propose to adopt today. We make a few changes along the way, particularly to Chapter 3 and some other chapters in the book. But in other words, we add back a chapter. The Fire Code adoption was a significant project in 2007. That's when we transitioned from the Uniform Fire Code to the new California Fire Code that's based on the ICC. In 2010, we added our sprinkler ordinance, and that was kind of a complicated affair as well. But this year, it's fairly straightforward. Most of our sections this year are maintenance related, and they carry over from previous sections that we adopted. A good example is the access and water standards that we've had for years, that we alter the code slightly so that they fit our local jurisdiction. And so we have various elements that we add from year to year, and we simply carry them over. If you look at Attachment 2, that's the proposed ordinance itself, and Attachment 1 is sort of a matrix that outlines a summary of the changes that we've made. When you look at the matrix, I think we have maybe 2 or 3 new sections that we've added. But most of the sections that are in the code are sections that we've had before in the past, and we're simply updating, we're bringing them forward. What I would like to point out is that in Chapter 3, there's one that doesn't appear on the summary matrix that actually is in the code that you have in your hands. And that is also in Chapter 3. It's Section 317.1.1 on page 7. It has to do with a new standard, actually an old standard, for what they call vegetated roofs or green roofs. Previously, we didn't allow green roofs in the high fire hazard area based on Chapter 49 of the code, which was based on defensible space standards. And now the state of California has added language about vegetated roofs in Chapter 3, so we thought it was more appropriate to take that standard and codify it into Chapter 3. We were still working on that when we made the summary of changes, so it doesn't appear on the summary, but if you look on page 7 on your ordinance, it does appear there. It still only applies to the high fire hazard area. It doesn't apply to anywhere else in the city. Another example from Chapter 3 is the barbecue section that Councilmember Hotchkiss asked me about. The barbecue section under 308.1.4, basically when we read the international code wrote it in such a way that it would virtually outlaw barbecues on patios in apartment buildings around the city. We thought that section was unworkable, unenforceable, and a little draconian. So what we did was we updated that section and made it so that any standard size bottle of propane, typical barbecue, like a family-style barbecue, would be allowed under those conditions. And that way we don't have to deal with the enforcement problem or all the potential pushback, rightfully so, from people who own barbecues. So that's another section that we updated. In that particular case, we're making the international code less stringent. That is allowed. The international code is not adopted as law under Chapter 3 in the state of California. So we're allowed to make that one less stringent. If you look at 49, in Chapter 49, we have a couple of new sections. 4906.1.2 clarifies the language about landscape plants. And these are plants that are installed.
On page 15, is that the one in ours?
Yes.
Yeah.
These are the plants that are installed outside of the permit process. And generally, it allows for some type of mitigation on our part or even cause for removal in extreme cases. And the background on it is that say an applicant builds on a vacant lot in the city. When they build it like a new structure, we would review the landscape plans and approve, based on the flammability rating of the plants, whether or not, their vegetation was appropriate for a high fire hazard area. And again, this only applies to high fire hazard. In this particular case, we found that a lot of homeowners, if you can completely re-landscape without a permit and end up with all kinds of inappropriate vegetation in the high fire hazard area. And we wanted a way to be able to mitigate that to a degree and outside of the defensible space requirements that we already have. So that section is new. That's been added. And another section that we added was also a maintenance section under defensible space, which basically allows us to look at vines growing on the sides of buildings and require maintenance of the dead material that's inside the vine in many cases, and while still allowing the vines to remain on the building.
I just have a quick question on that before we move on. So it says here, for instance, on 4906.1.2, it says vegetation installed without an approved landscape plan shall be removed if, in the opinion of the fire code official, it's capable of being ignited. The shall be removed. It doesn't say here at the cost of the owner or anything. Could it be interpreted that it would be the cost might be borne by the city, or is it just enough to say, and maybe this is for Mr. Vincent, but to not be specific about that? I mean, you could look over a property line and see that there's a vegetation situation. It could be a problem in a high fire area, and you could require it to be removed.
I'll defer to Mr. Vincent on that, but on the legal part of that. But generally, when the code uses the expression "shall," it is can be interpreted as a requirement, but it would be a requirement that we impose, not one that we would typically go out and perform.
I understand.
Yeah, yes, Mr. Chair. I would concur with that approach. This is a construction that's used frequently throughout the code, and this language is consistent with the way other mandates are stated in the code.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And I think I was talking about access and water and that type of thing. We basically have we've gone minimalist this year and have made as few changes as possible. So what you see here is what we've had in the past, with the exception of 3 new sections. And in summary, it's the amended sections from the last code are carrying over. The combined California and building and fire codes are basically ready to go. And in this 3rd code cycle, we believe that this code gives us a high degree of fire and life safety, and we're requesting that you pass it on to full council for approval. And if you have any questions for us, I'd be happy to answer.
And before we go any further, I don't see anyone in the audience to speak to this. Do we have any speaker slips? Okay, great. Yes, Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you, sir. We use the term inappropriate plants. What does that mean? Can you describe that?
Well, there's our plants in high hazard areas are reviewed by our wildland specialist, Ann Marks. And without going into, there's a myriad of plants. Junipers are a good example that we don't generally allow to be planted on new construction in the high fire hazard area. It's simply because they're too flammable.
Would that be anywhere on the new construction or just near the house? Or
that would be anywhere within the landscape plan, within the lot, correct.
Okay. Does this code or adoption of this code in any way change any of our parking requirements up in the narrow roads and the hillsides?
No, it doesn't. And, we have a lot of streets, in the extreme foothill and the foothill zones that aren't really, they're pretty much existing nonconforming. The code doesn't alter any of that and never has. The code sections that we have apply to new construction, if you're building a development or if you're building a new house or something like that, to make sure that the access to that new structure is in place. But it doesn't come back and apply to existing nonconforming situations in city infrastructure.
I can remember it in somebody up in the Riviera, somewhere, lower Riviera, was unhappy because they couldn't have guests to their house that could park on the street. And it turns out the reason we had no parking signs, but it was because of the narrowness of the street and the necessity of access to higher up in the hills for engines.
Correct. That was on Arbolado, I believe.
I think you're right.
That would be a typical situation in a street that's already too narrow for us, and is part of our main evacuation route, one of our main evacuation routes, which Arbolado is. That's one of those situations where parking could severely restrict the ability of engines to get up and residents to get down.
Right. Is this more restrictive, or I guess that's a relative term, but you sort of said it isn't the adoption of this code. Would you call it more restrictive than our past codes?
In terms of access?
Whatever.
Oh, no. I wouldn't characterize this as more restrictive at all. It's pretty much what we had in 2010. It's pretty much the same code. And the state, we also vet every section that the state adds. We do this over a period of time. We have 180 days, and when the state finishes their code, we go through it section by section just to see what's going to affect us. And the state hasn't changed very much either. It's pretty much the same code they had in 2010.
What does a city do, particularly not us, but a smaller city, when there are certain requirements of volume and pressure at the hydrant, and they don't live up to that? I mean, those seem to me to be pretty high requirements. I'm glad we meet them.
There is an out in the code that allows the local jurisdiction to deal with their local situation and make it work. And that's basically a code official discretion within that jurisdiction. If they just can't meet it, if the infrastructure doesn't meet it, it doesn't meet it. And they find another way. And basically what they would do is write a section that calls it good, that says this is what we've got and this is all we can provide.
Got it. Thank you.
Mr. Rouse, did you have questions for staff at this point?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, Chief, this is the new language is primarily about residences as opposed to commercial. Is that correct?
In the high fire sections, that's correct.
Okay, so there's no real, other than just residential, there's not a real any commercial piece to the new parts of the ordinance?
There could be a few that would be affected by this, but we don't have that many commercial properties. So it's primarily in high fire hazard areas like the foothill and extreme foothill. It's mostly residential that's affected by this.
Mr. Rouse, you do have some very interesting language in here addressing the phenomenon of mixed use, and you've added some of that, which had to do with the commercial on the ground floor, and then sensitivity and accommodations for the fact that people above need to be notified, need to be able to hear the alarm and things like that, right? I mean, there's a number of those that are addressing kind of the direction our general plan is encouraging some of our new development.
That's exactly right. We started adding that question, it's hard to believe, but 20 years ago now. The reason was because even back then, the city was looking for places to put residential properties, and we were finding them above storefronts that would be closed at night, and we were responding to a heart attack, for example. We would get to the call, and there'd be nothing there but an empty storefront, and firefighters were unaware that there was a residence upstairs. So we started making those things mandatory, the residents upstairs in the event of a fire downstairs would be notified by the automatic detection, and we would be notified with that code on the front that says R3 or R2 that there are residences upstairs.
Well, thank you for asking that, Mr. Chair, because that was part of my question as well, as the city is trying to move towards this urbanization of residential multi-unit areas, and I thought about and mentioned the rooftop vegetation, roof gardens, things we've dealt with in the AUD. I assume that this is going to apply in those situations as well, as far as a landscape plan or permittable plantings in a rooftop or residential area. Is that correct?
Yes, of course. That would be in the high fire hazard area.
Not in the downtown core?
The rooftop vegetation, we've been accused of being anti-green roof, but we're not. In the downtown area and other sections of the city, that's the vegetated roofs are an allowable thing. So the vegetated roof prohibition only exists in the high fire hazard area.
There wouldn't be a limit as to what types of vegetation you could have on your roof?
Not outside of that area, no.
All right, thank you.
I just noticed this fireworks prohibition, and you're really asserting the city's right to be more restrictive with fireworks. We prohibit them no matter whether they're considered safe and sane according to state code.
That's correct.
And then I didn't see changes to the findings that give us the privilege to make these kinds of adaptations. The findings have all stayed the same.
The findings have stayed the same, correct. They're pretty stable, and we wrote those in 2007 when we adopted that code. They all remain true today. The sundowner conditions. We've added a couple of things over the years: the T fire and the Hazazita fire, of course. They minor changes over the years, but this year we didn't add anything to the findings.
And besides the two changes you mentioned to Chapter 3 that aren't in this table here, are there other things that aren't in the table that you want to call to our attention?
No, everything else is in the table. Everything that we changed is in the table.
All right, good. So the staff recommendation is that we review and recommend for approval to the City Council this ordinance amending the municipal code. Do I have a motion for that?
You do.
And second.
All right, great. So all in favor, say aye.
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 All right, thank you, guys. Thank you very much for your
Thank you very much.
work. Thanks for making this comprehensible for us lay people. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
You want to announce it?
Are we ready to go here?
Just looking over here. So do you want to announce the next item, please?
The next item is the adoption and amendments to the California Building Code.
Okay, great. And Mr. Cassidy's here to get us started. Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair, council members. My name is Larry Cassidy. I'm the Building Inspection Code Enforcement Supervisor for the Building and Safety Division. With me today are Lonnie Cassidy. She's the Supervisor for the Plan Check Division. And we also have Teresa Lancy here from Water Resources to answer any questions you may have regarding some changes we have. Also, Joe Poirier, he touched on quite a few items that might be in my presentation, so if I'll skim over those pretty quickly, just to save time here. The presentation will cover the proposed amendments and adoption of the 2013 California codes. Okay, next one. So what we'd like to do is answer a few questions, provide a bit of background regarding the California codes, explain the basics about the code adoption process. As I said, Mr. Poirier explained most of that, so I'll skim over that. And then we'll get into looking at specific amendments or one in particular. First, I'd like to explain that the California building codes, as they're typically called, are more accurately called Title 24, and that's part of the California Code of Regulations. The CC&Rs, or California Code of Regulations, is made up of 28 different titles, Title 24 being directly related to construction and design of buildings and facilities and equipment. And is made up of 12 parts. And each part of Title 24 is based on one of the codes, in other words, plumbing code, mechanical code, electrical code. I'll try to be consistent with my terminology here because there are many different terms that get thrown around loosely in the industry. So this here shows the parts of Title 24. As you can see, Part 1 is the administrative Building Standards Administrative Code, and that specifies how the California Building Standards Commission addresses code adoption and puts it forth to the state on a triennial basis. Part 2.5, that is not a typo. It's California Residential Code was actually introduced the last code cycle, and as opposed to just renumbering, they created a 2.5 to fit it into the existing terminology. Next one. And to kind of tie in Joe Poirier's presentation, you can see Part 9, the California Fire Code, is part of Title 24. That's why we work so closely together with the fire department in construction and also in the maintenance of properties as well. You can look at Part 11. See, Parts 11 and 12 are both standards as opposed to codes. Part 11 being the Green Building Standards Code. We're getting into water conservation, efficient lighting, quite a few areas that are fairly new to the code, are rather difficult to enforce, but we do our best. We believe it's best for the community and the environment as a whole. Part 12, the California Reference Standards Code, refers to testing of fire resistance materials. They can test vents, insulation standards, accessibility, exiting, just about all the standards that are referred to throughout the other parts of Title 24 are directed to that group of standards, Part 12. Okay. As Mr. Poirier mentioned, it's a triennial cycle. We go through this every 3 years. Occasionally, one code will come out, the electrical code, out of sequence, and we'll make some changes. Or the plumbing code, we've done that before, where I believe there were some errors in our adoption process, and we brought it forward out of sequence. Again, I mentioned the code development process is overseen by the California Building Standards Commission. That's a government-appointed commission. and they oversee and ensure that the codes are put forth in a timely fashion. Generally, 18 months before the effective date of the codes, they come out, and or they start the process 6 months before the effective date. The codes are published and put out there so the local jurisdictions can take them, study them, and make local amendments to ensure that they take care of any unique situations that may occur in various jurisdictions throughout the state. Regardless of what happens, and Mr. Poirier touched on it, January 1st, this suite of codes, all these parts of Title 24 become effective, regardless if we make changes. So this is quite a process that takes place all over the state, actually all over the country at this time of year when the codes are published on a triennial basis. So we are not the only jurisdiction going through this process right now. It's taking place all up and down the state and across the country. I'd like to mention there are a couple of codes that aren't part of Title 24. It's the International Property Maintenance Code and the Uniform Code for Abatement of Dangerous Buildings. Those are very, as far as the scale of the codes, are very small. They're thin little booklets almost, but they're very powerful, and they assist communities in maintaining safe housing, safe structures for people that are shopping or visiting. So those are very important, but there's not a whole lot of changes that takes place in those codes.
Before you go, Larry, where is that in the? You just referenced those. Is that integral to the to our local Title 24 building codes, or are these just appendices that are separate?
They are separate codes in themselves, but they don't follow the typical path that Title 24 does. In other words, they're known as the International Property Maintenance Code as opposed to the California Property Maintenance Code. The same with the Uniform Code for Abatement of Dangerous Buildings. It's not the California Code for Abatement of Dangerous Buildings. It is a code that is published by the International Code Council, and it doesn't go through that amendment process with the state, but we can still adopt those codes.
Are we seeing those today, or any changes in those today?
Yes, there are some minor changes for those.
Okay, and then they become part of our municipal code.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, again, local amendments must be made on findings of climate or geology or topography that warrants amendments. The California Building Standards Code can also be amended by adoption of appendix chapters, and we'll go over one of those appendix chapters in a few minutes. One other additional note to mention is the findings that we make for these amendments must be filed with the California Building Standards Commission prior to the effective date in order for the amendments to become effective. Okay, this is in regards to one of the appendix chapters I mentioned. Radon gas. It's not a new appendix chapter. It's been there. It was there the last cycle. The previous cycle, I'm not sure about. When I started looking into this a little bit more, started to realize that we are unique in our area here in Southern California, that radon is a problem. It's an odorless gas that is typically present in Rincon or Monterey Shale, which is present in several areas of town, and we'll get into a different map in a second. The EPA estimates that there are 21,000 lung cancer-related deaths due to radon exposure per year. We felt it was worth digging into a little bit more, doing some research, and what we found, I discussed it with the building official and planning department or planning division, and we decided it was important that we adopt this appendix this year. The EPA recommends radon hazard mitigation at levels at or above 4 picocuries per liter in a residential structure. Now, I'm not exactly sure how that unit of measurement came about, what it means, but it does help when we're doing the research on the testing that has taken place. In this map here, the red indicates level 1, and those are counties that have a predicted average indoor radon screening level greater than 4 picocuries per liter. The orange areas are zone 2 counties that have a predicted indoor radon screening level between 2 and 4 picocuries. And zone 3, or the yellow, are less than 2 picocuries per liter. And this map here kind of magnifies the other map we had. And as you can see, Ventura County and Santa Barbara County are quite unique in California. The West Coast in general, but California in particular, we kind of stand out quite a bit. And again, this is showing zone 1, 2, and 3 with those same readings.
Do these maps reflect actual data, or are these all estimates? Do we know?
The first two I'm not sure about. The next map, please. This is the local area map that was developed as part of the mass environmental assessment and the safety element of the general plan through planning, prepared by URS. I'm not sure if they used the soil type to get this, or if they actually did radon testing. Because what I have found in the reading I've been doing is until you build a home, complete the envelope, enclose it, and shut it in, close the windows in the wintertime, you're using the heat. When you enclose that interior environment, that's when you have trouble with radon. If it is leaking in through the floor somehow, it concentrates, and that's where you get the elevated levels. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Mr. Ross.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, looking at and being relatively familiar with the soil types and the formations in town, that really does match up almost one-to-one with those particular shale formations. And I am curious because I know that for example, in the national map, when you've got areas of the country that do close their homes up for extended periods of time, that must be a different situation. Certainly Santa Barbara, I wouldn't think would be. I mean, that's why going back to Mr. Hodges' question, is it data based on rock formations, or do we actually have testing? And I kind of suspect it's probably based on the types of geologic formations.
Yes, I think, Councilmember Rouse, your point about Santa Barbara, we typically have our windows open. We get some airflow. I think that's part of what you were getting at, right? That does help. The airflow is what's key to preventing this gas from building up. I do have some figures here that were part of the safety element, which talk about testing of individual properties and homes and how those tests came out. So if you give me a second, I'll get to it here. So these are actual test result data from various areas of town. In the 93101 or downtown and west side areas, there were 70 tests, and only one came out at 4 picocuries per liter or higher. In 93103, which is the lower Riviera and east side, out of 84 tests, there were 8 that reported in at 4 or higher. In 93105, which is the upper Riviera, upper state, portions of Las Positas, and it also included several areas of unincorporated areas north of the city. However, the data is quite remarkable. In 352 tests, 91 came in at 4 picocuries per liter or higher. And we have one other area, 93109, or the Mesa and parts of Las Positas. Out of 104 tests, 4 came in at elevated levels. So that one group at 352 tests, 91 coming back at 4 picocuries per liter or higher is just something that deserved a little more attention. And I do have some additional testing that I didn't bring with me. It's a radon testing laboratory. They publish, and this might be where these came from, but they publish their results by zip code like this. And I looked at it a little further. Even prompted me to test my home. I was in one of the level 2 areas, so I was interested myself as I went forth in this research.
And once again, Mr. Cassidy, when they do that testing, they're doing it actually in the home or in the soil where the home is built?
Okay, I understand your question here,
Somebody that's
Councilmember Rouse.
watching this might all of a sudden be very concerned, so I think it's appropriate that we...
Correct. The testing that I was looking at, and I believe this testing seems to match up, is within the home. And from the reading I've been doing on the EPA website and several sites that they directed me to, it's difficult to tell. In other words, if you're going to build a home, if you go in and do soils testing, it's difficult to get an accurate reading on what radon exposure you might experience in your new home until it's actually built. So that's one of the reasons this appendix chapter that we're looking to adopt just seems like if you look at the difficulty in retrofitting a home versus what this appendix chapter asks for the contractor or the builder to do during construction, it's quite easy to add this radon-resistant new construction, they call it. So it's quite easy to add this radon-resistant construction into a new home, but very difficult to retrofit.
Gotcha.
Sorry. That radon-resistant construction, is it primarily a matter of air circulation?
Can you hit the next slide, please?
Or the house breathing a little more? Or?
It is basically an effort to, if you look at this slide here, to seal the bottom of the slab or the crawl space effectively enough to allow the radon gas to escape out this vent pipe that is also part of the appendix chapter F. Some pieces of this appendix chapter, number one is a gas permeable layer of gravel or sand. It's an extra 4 inches of excavation, and then you fill with this gas permeable material. And then you run a vent pipe throughout that, similar to a perforated pipe that you use for a French drain. Well, you run that in that gas permeable layer, and it tees up through the roof. So the gas is easily channeled up through that vent. If we don't have the gas permeable layer of fill, or if you don't seal it properly, the gas can build up pressure, and if your HVAC system is not set up properly, or if you have windows open on one side of the house and you get a Venturi effect, you can create a negative pressure in the home, which can pull in air from underneath the slab or through the attic or anywhere. The negative pressure in a home happens quite often, and if you put your hand up to a light switch or something, you can feel air coming in. It's just a phenomena that takes place due to the physics of airflow. So the purpose is to provide that gas permeable layer, seal it properly with visqueen, and also seal any vents that are coming up through that plastic. So you're essentially sealing the bottom part of the home.
And it's an entirely passive system as described here?
Correct. It is a passive system. However, they also recommend in some areas, like, say, the level 1, where you have high potential for radon exposure, they suggest to install the passive system and test after the home is built and install a fan if need be.
Okay.
A little bit more on the radon here. I have some figures regarding which states and jurisdictions have adopted this chapter or some sort of chapter. 25 states have no statewide or local jurisdiction regarding radon-resistant new construction. And California is one of those right now. 7 states have statewide radon-resistant construction codes that apply to designated zones. 17 states do not have statewide radon-resistant construction codes, but do have local radon-resistant codes in place. And 4 states do have statewide radon-resistant new construction codes, but must be adopted locally. I also looked into the cost of this, and the estimates came in at about $2 per square foot. So if we're looking at a 2,000 square foot home, you're looking at $4,000 for a slab on grade. If it's a raised floor system where you have a crawl space, it'll be less than that. It's about $1.50 per square foot.
Is the same kind of ceiling required in a raised foundation?
Yes, it is. It just would not be hidden by the slab. You do need the gas permeable layer, and you need the membrane installed and sealed up against the raised foundation walls, and any vents that come up through have to be sealed properly.
Thank you.
You're talking, this whole conversation is about this Appendix F, radon control methods, general?
Correct.
And that's brand new. That hasn't been there before.
Correct. We have not adopted that chapter in the past.
Okay. Any more to your presentation today?
No, that concludes my presentation unless you have further questions.
Yeah, well, we'll also open the public hearing. Don't see anyone here to speak to this, although you're sure welcome to. And, okay, we'll close the public hearing. We'll go to questions from the committee. Mr. Hotchkiss.
Have we talked to our local contractors about this at all?
I have spoken to one of them. That's where I received the estimates on the construction cost, but we have not spoken with the Contractors Association about it in general, no.
Do we plan to do that, to get some input from them before we bring it to council?
We had not planned on doing that. We did send out the Land Development Team Bulletin to the Contractors Association, and also goes out to the AIA. And there are various other people who sign up for this bulletin, but we can take it to them and ask them a few questions.
Yeah, I think we should, because they're the experts, and frankly, we're not.
The quick question then on that point. This hearing today was noticed in general, I mean, the normal way that we notice a city council or an ordinance committee meeting. And we do this annually? No, it's not. We really don't do this every year, do we?
Yes, triennial cycle. Every 3 years we come.
Yeah. So I'm just curious, did we have any comments from contractors or any? I don't see anything in our staff report. Has anybody commented at all on the codes this time?
I did receive one email. Have you received any other emails?
Right. We did send out the code adoption information and the meeting dates when we did the LDT bulletin, which went to the Contractors Association and to the AIA. The Contractors Association also had an expo last week, which I attended and had a copy of that. The only feedback that we got was actually from the Realtors Association, and that was regarding the fire sprinkler requirements for existing buildings. And then they also had a question about vegetation requirements, and we received that email yesterday. And I had corresponded back to them with just confirmation of fire sprinkler ordinance requirements have been in effect since 2009. And then the vegetation question was about whether that pertained to new construction or all properties.
Okay, very good. And so we haven't had any other communications from any of them since. I'm just looking at the table here that you provided for us, and a lot of what's in here, a lot of it is existing, or like improvements to how something's explained or something, the standing practices. And that there are a few things that are new that you've been talking about, and in particular the one about pool barriers and the ones about radon. And the private sewage disposal system compliance, which you didn't discuss here yet today. Are there any others like that? I see just a few more, but they seem to be more about coming into compliance. Is this particular one about radon and the one about the pools? These are local phenomena based on our findings, that we would have these particular issues in our part of the state as opposed to what might be, elsewhere?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to say the appendix chapter for swimming pools, we used to cover that using a local amendment, but after reviewing the appendix chapter, we felt it was a better fit to accomplish our goal for keeping pools separated from children, to make sure that no one is hurt or injured or, God forbid, killed due to a lack of a proper safety barrier. So the code this year, and it may have been last year, but we didn't adopt it. But this year we looked at it quite closely and decided that it was a good fit and it accomplished everything our local amendment had previously. So we deleted our local amendment that we had the previous cycle and went with what was in the residential code.
Okay, very good. And on the private sewage disposal system compliance?
Yes. Currently, the county and several jurisdictions are getting together. I believe Heal the Ocean has even been in attendance. They are trying to come up with a county-wide ordinance to handle private sewage disposal systems.
Septic tanks, you mean that kind of
Correct.
thing? Right.
And Lonnie, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, actually, so previously when we had a septic tank that was proposed, it would actually have to go to the State Water Board local division to be reviewed. The states actually changed that so it empowers the local agencies to have their own process, and we've actually been participating with that, the County of Santa Barbara, to align with their requirements. They see far more septic systems than we do. Typically, a city like ourselves would have an agreement with the county to review septic systems, which we have not had in place. This will allow us to review the septic systems ourselves. It was very onerous on the property owners to go to the state level, and with the many changes that are happening statewide, they've given that back to the local jurisdictions, and we're just joining with the County of Santa Barbara. We've been participating in, it's called a LAMP, their local area management plan.
So this will actually make it easier for the homeowners in Braemar, Veronica Springs area that are just in the city.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We had a couple that came in through T-Fire lots, and I think the review process ended up being 6 to 9 months before they could be reviewed at the state level.
Okay.
So it's actually been a very good thing, and we've been participating with, the county did the research, and they've also had the public hearing. So we are working with, like Larry had said, Heal the Ocean and the other vested interested parties for the regulations.
All right, very good. And then would it be possible between now and when if it moves beyond, I think it will, but if the ordinance committee refers this to city council with a recommendation, would it be possible to make sure that a copy of what's being forwarded is sent over to the Contractors Association, just so they can, just with this matrix in particular, because it's kind of helpful to sort it out. And then they would have that if they felt they wanted to come and comment, they could.
Yeah, they actually did get a copy of that.
Oh, they did?
Yeah. So
I misunderstood.
Yeah, the LDT bulletin included all of this information
great.
and the dates.
All right, very good. Any other questions or comments, Mr. Rouse? Your light's on there?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. Back to the radon issue. I know it's not a new issue, obviously, but I'm a little concerned about the presentation you mentioned earlier, talking about the Board of Realtors. I don't think you've really paid attention to this one yet. But I think that the way this map is illustrated, it almost looks as if we're pooling these concentrations, and that it delineates from one neighborhood to the other neighborhood what may or may not be a high radon zone. I'm not sure, given the amount of actual testing samples we've had, the amount of data we've had, if this would be a real fair way to illustrate this as we get into the public eye at the council meeting when we go over this again. And I would like us to maybe consider another way to display this, or maybe have the actual test data and bullet where those were. My fear is this, is that one neighborhood versus the other neighborhood, it becomes, you're in the high hazard zone. Well, no, that one's across the street. Here's where the line is, right over here. And I think this is drawn out for the purpose of having a map and being illustrative. It's almost like the EPA map showing all of the South Coast being this high elevated radon zone. Maybe just a little bit more alarming than it needs to be, given the lack of real empirical data that we have. So I don't know if there's another way to be able to illustrate that, or another way to explain that. I just don't want to send the public into a tizzy over something that may not be as huge a deal as it. I mean, it's a big deal. People should be aware of it, but I think we better be very clear and careful before we say this zone, that the Mesa is a high radon zone, when in fact, 3 houses away there may be a 0, and the other way there might be a 6. So I'm a little concerned about this presentation in that way.
Well, let's ask a question then of staff on that. So how is it intended to be used? The building code requirement and or even the map that was used to illustrate included here. How are these intended to be used when it comes to somebody's building? I guess it's for somebody building something new or adding on to their existing home. What kicks in when, and what's the criteria? What's the bar?
Mr. Chair, the requirement kicks in for new residential construction. In other words, a new structure. It wouldn't come into play for an addition or remodels, just a new single family or a duplex, triplex. That's when it would be required. I believe there are some jurisdictions that require this during the transaction, as far as a real estate transaction, but that's not anything that we're looking to incorporate into this. It's only for new construction.
And how do we know where, like let's say it was a particular address, and how do we know that address is one that is going to be required to do this or not? Or is it something that would be across the board throughout the whole city, or is it geographically defined, or is it correspond to this map?
Corresponds with the map, the highest detail map that we had up on the PowerPoint presentation.
How detailed does that get, Larry? I mean, does it get down to street addresses, or this parcel, that parcel, or how do we know where that line is?
It is a PDF file, so it can be blown up quite large. I admit that putting it onto a 8.5 by 11 is not its best presentation. It would be similar to the flood zone maps that we have over at Community Development. We would have a large printout of it, and the plan checker, if there's someone that's on the border, they would have to extrapolate to figure out, okay, does the footprint of this building, is it contacting Zone 1 or Zone 2? That would be the only way for us to come up with the list, as far as I know. One example I can think of is the Caneo Slide area. We have a list of parcels. We know which ones exactly are in that area, but we haven't gone that far with this appendix chapter.
Well, I think you heard a little bit of concern. Maybe Mr. Hotchkiss has it as well. So we're pretty clear about it. So it's not, we don't have too much of a gray area. That people know whether they're in or they're out, and that way also for our staff we know. But anyway, Mr. Hotchkiss.
Yeah, well, it's a little bit the proverbial can of worms. If I've lived in my house for 20 years, and then the next door neighbor tears down their house and rebuilds, and suddenly they have radon risk, it's not because their house moved or the earth moved or anything. It's just because we got a new criteria. And I can see, knowing how risk-averse realtors are, this is going to become a disclosure issue. And so I echo Mr. Rouse's concern that we proceed really cautiously with this. And maybe we ought to have a lot of mays instead of shalls in this wording, that this may be an area of concern regarding radon instead of is, we have it's nice and neat on a map, and that makes it easy to enforce and stuff. But the reality is, there's no line like that on the ground at all. So I'm sort of saying we should make this as loose, or I don't know if optional is the right word, but as loose as possible and not upset people, because I think it really could upset people. I mean, it's an odorless, colorless gas, and you can't detect it, so they're like, oh, my God, we've got it here, you know? So we don't want that, for sure. Agreed? Make sense?
Yes, Councilmember Hotchkiss, I do agree with you. It could ruffle some people's feathers and kind of raise but, you know, the awareness might not be a bad thing. I mentioned I did test my own home. The test, I think the total cost was about $12 or $13. You sign up, they send you this charcoal canister, you set it out in your home for 2 days, put it back in the envelope and send it back, and they post your results online. You put in your code, and you can get your results online, and they'll also send it to you in the mail.
That's a great suggestion, a good solution, too. I just, again, want to be careful that people don't get terribly worried about living in Santa Barbara. I've known people actually won't come here because of, not of radon, but you live in Southern California, there's an earthquake down there every now and then. I say, well, yes, I mean, oh, well, I'm not coming, you know, so we don't need one more thing.
I think, and I think the comments bear appreciation. The fact is, this is a health and safety issue, and that's what the building codes are about in large part. So the degree of certainty that we can offer to whomever's in whatever area, you know, that we're concerned about. The geologic structure is the one that gives us concern, and we want to make sure that they are tested. And then there's remediations or things that they can do when they're in the middle of a building process. Better they should have the information up front instead of finding out later and then being very costly having to redo something. So I think there's two sides to this. Mr. Rouse?
Well, I just reading the EPA's website as well, and they talk about 1 of every 15 homes in the United States has an elevated level of radon. So that suggests that even looking at the national map, it's probably a little more widespread. It's more pocketed, and that was my concerns about this. You know, brushing these stripes of color in these different areas, saying this is and this is not. You may find one downtown that has elevated sources of radon. You've got radon in groundwater that is also, you know, can be an issue. I don't know if we test for that or not currently in our water services, but and like Grant said, I think there's definitely a public information piece that needs to happen. No question about it. It's a health and safety issue. I just want to make sure that we're not damning certain areas and condemning them vis-a-vis these illustrations. And that's my initial gut reaction to this, like, oh my God, everybody on the Mesa is going to die, or that kind of thing. So I would like to have strong recommendations or whatever we can do to get people involved without like say devaluing somebody's neighborhood unnecessarily.
Well, let me ask a question. I'm going to ask a question of you, Mr. Rouse, and then we can carry on this important discussion. And that would be when we're looking at the building code, this is for a building of something new, a new house, a new duplex or triplex. So that would be the point. There's some additional costs associated with making these provisions at that point, right? It has to go with the foundation in between, right? In between the foundation, as you showed us here, and with the vent pipe and a system, almost like a reverse French drain kind of. All right. So the cost factor and the health benefit, I mean, what is, first of all, I'm going to ask you, Mr. Cassidy, what is that? Is it a tremendous issue?
The cost factor is, in speaking with some local contractors, it's about $2 a square foot. So an average, say, 2,000 square foot home.
Oh, that's where you got that.
It's going to cost 4, you an extra $4,000.
But the retrofit later, once you build it and then you find out you've got a problem, that could be more costly.
That would get costly because you have to core the slab. You have to install a fan that is running to create a negative pressure under the slab. And that cost would eventually add up as well.
Okay, so this educational component to it could save the homeowner quite a bit of money. Mr. Estrella?
If I can just chime in or add something for consideration. We are on a schedule to get the codes adopted, and this would be part of that cycle. We're already set going to city council, et cetera. One of the things that we could do is pull this item, this appendix for time being, better prepare in terms of meeting with various organizations, et cetera. And we can always come back at a later time when we feel comfortable to bring it forward after perhaps we've contacted and had discussions and we kind of feel this is the right thing to do. I would say it is a life safety issue. It is something that we have. How we go about addressing, I think, is very important, and we need to be very sensitive about that. But because we are on a time schedule to get the major codes adopted, one option would be is we just withhold back this particular appendix section, reach out a little bit more to the public, have the interaction, meet with various associations who would have some input, and then as we feel more comfortable with it, we could bring it back at a later date. It doesn't have to go with the other codes at this point. We'd like it to, but it's not necessary to do that.
Well, let's see how we feel about it, because, I mean, certainly the pink color in the map is supposed to indicate an actual reality in the ground, not just not just an arbitrary area, and I think that's a key component of this. Mr. Hotchkiss?
I thought Mr. Strahan's idea was good.
We're going to turn on your mic.
Sorry. I thought your idea was good to, as it were, sort of educate the public more that people are going to be affected rather than have a surprise.
Mr. Ross?
Well, I would agree, and my concern is that, I mean, I'm just saying we're not putting out false information. I'm saying I want to make sure if we present the data, that is done in a correct way and not in a way that may be either over-alarming or over-comforting. We should get as much good spot data as we can and just really see, because, this is a pretty diverse area geologically and certainly, in terms of drainages and whatnot. So it's really hard to say, boom, this is the color pink or orange or whatever it is without almost going parcel by parcel, which obviously we can't do either. So the information should go out, but Mr. Estrella does have a good suggestion, I believe, and that's to get a little bit of outreach just for the presentation. I think the presentation is going to be very important.
Mr. Estrella, how long do you think that would take? Are we waiting another 3 years to have this get back into the code, or is this something that would come back much sooner?
As far as we making out and reaching the public and contacting the various organizations, it's probably going to take a few months to reach out and try to get some information. In the meantime, we could come back after January, for example, and bring this forward as a possible code adoption.
Okay.
So that would be my recommendation, and if you agree with it, then we'll go ahead and withdraw that particular chapter for now, and then we could allow the other codes to move forward, and we could do a little better job of reaching out and getting the information and making sure everything's accurate and feeling comfortable with moving forward when the time is right.
And once again, if it surpasses state law, we can adopt again at any time. We can amend the code if we so decide. It doesn't have to be in a specific cycle.
No, it does not.
Yeah. So, I mean, we could come back in 3 months and say, okay, now we've got it exactly the way we want it.
That's good. That was my concern, and because I thought I'd heard that we had any changes we wanted to have, we had to have them in before the 1st of January. I didn't quite understand that you could add on without waiting another 3 years.
You could.
We could.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right.
This is not the major body of the code. This is an appendix chapter to the code. So for those major portions of the code, we would have to stay on track. But this is just an amendment. It's an additional book that comes in the back of where local jurisdictions may or may not choose to adopt that section.
All right. Well, very good. I know that in other parts of the country, certainly this is a big topic in the home improvement centers and the Home Depots and the rest. Radon is kind of a big deal. I think they have these home testing kits, and I guess that must be what you were getting, Mr. Cassidy, or something. But it is a big enough deal that people are retrofitting, getting underneath their, getting the ventilation fans and everything in there, but on purpose to really protect their family's well-being. Basements, we don't have a whole lot of them here, but basements are notorious in fireplaces too, right? As a way for the radon to get into the home. And so maybe this is part of an education for the broader community, not really at the building moment. There's going to be others who really will want to make an improvement to their home. All righty. I think we've got something. Anybody want to make a motion?
Sure. Happy to make a motion as described with the removal and subsequent investigation of the radon part, but move forward with the rest of the proposed ordinance here.
Strauss?
I'll second that motion.
Okay, and I would hope this could come back within the next 6 months. Do you think that would be enough time, Mr. Estrella?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, that might be our recommendation as well, that it gets, so we keep it timely and keep this.
Well,
on
let's
the
say
front
6
burner.
months or faster. You might even be able to do it by the first of the year. Who knows if you get great cooperation.
All right. All right, then. All those in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Okay, thank you very much today. Thank you very much. All right, I think that's it for us today on ordinance. Thank you all.